This is the story of how 879 American sailors died waiting for a rescue that came 4 days late, and how the Navy blamed the one man who couldn't have stopped it. The water was black and warm just past midnight somewhere in the Philippine Sea, and a sailor floated in his life jacket, listening to the sounds around him. Hundreds of men drifted nearby in the darkness, some screaming and some praying, while others slipped beneath the surface without making a sound. Oil coated everything from skin to eyes to throats, and the sea burned wherever it touched open wounds. Rescue wasn't coming that night, or the next day, or for 4 days after, but the men in the water didn't know that yet. Something brushed against one sailor's leg, and he told himself it was debris from the ship because that was easier than considering the alternative. The sinking of the USS Indianapolis took only 12 minutes, but the nightmare that followed lasted nearly 100 hours. Sharks circled and fed, while the Navy that knew the ship was overdue did nothing to find her, and the captain who survived those waters would eventually be destroyed by his own country. When the dying finally stopped, 879 men were gone, and that's when the Navy went looking for someone to blame. The Indianapolis was a Portland-class heavy cruiser built in the 1930s, when naval strategists still believed cruisers would decide the next war. She stretched 610 feet from bow to stern, with 9 8-inch guns mounted in 3 turrets, fast enough to screen the battle fleet, and armored well enough to absorb punishment. By the summer of 1945, she had become a veteran of the Pacific, having carried President Roosevelt to conferences and combat zones before bombarding the beaches at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. A kamikaze strike off Okinawa killed 9 of her crew and sent her limping back to the shipyards for repair. But the ship herself mattered far less than the cargo she would soon carry. Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III came from Navy royalty with a father who had risen to admiral and a grandfather who had done the same before him. The sea ran through his bloodline the way money runs through a banking family, not just as profession but as identity itself. His career had taken him through cruisers and destroyers, and he'd earned each command the slow way before taking over the Indianapolis in November of 1944. The crew respected him as competent and steady, the kind of officer who did his job correctly and expected everyone else to do the same, and he trusted the system because the system had always rewarded men like him. July of 1945 found the war in Europe finished, while the Pacific ground toward some unknown conclusion. With American bombers reducing Japanese cities to ash, and military planners assuming 1 million American casualties if invasion became necessary, something else was coming that summer, though almost no one knew what it was. The Indianapolis arrived at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in San Francisco on July 16th, with her repairs complete, and McVeigh expected his crew would receive liberty, followed by a few weeks of routine training. What he received instead were classified orders telling him to report to Hunters Point, take on special cargo, deliver it to Tinian Island in the Marianas, and ask no questions. The cargo arrived in 2 pieces that immediately set the crew talking in their berthing compartments. A metal canister, roughly 18 inches tall and welded completely shut, came first, accompanied by 2 Army officers who refused to leave its side for the entire voyage, and slept next to it on the deck of the captain's cabin, where it had been bolted down. McVeigh had to step around this canister just to reach his own bunk. A wooden crate weighing several hundred pounds came second, locked inside a compartment where armed Marines stood guard around the clock, and no one entered without authorization. Rumors spread through the ship the way rumors always do in close quarters, with sailors guessing it was gold or a secret weapon or bacteriological agents meant for the Japanese emperor. McVeigh received only the bare minimum of information, learning that the cargo was vital to the war effort and that if the ship went down, this canister had to be saved before any sailor. What he never learned was that he was carrying the core components of Little Boy, the uranium projectile and target rings that would destroy Hiroshima in 11 days and kill 140,000 people. The Indianapolis departed San Francisco on July 16th, which happened to be the same day the Trinity test lit up the New Mexico desert, and the crew knew nothing about that either. McVeigh requested a destroyer escort, because standard procedure called for one when carrying sensitive cargo through waters where Japanese submarines still operated, but his request came back denied with the explanation that no escort was available. When he asked for intelligence on submarine activity along his route, he received a summary mentioning only possible enemy contacts, and that summary deliberately omitted a crucial fact. Just days earlier, the destroyer escort USS Underhill had been torpedoed and broken in half along the same path by a Japanese Kaiten suicide torpedo, killing 84 American sailors. McVeigh was never told, and the Navy would remember these details very differently once survivors started asking questions. The crossing to Pearl Harbor set a speed record of 74 hours, covering more than 5,000 miles, one of the fastest Pacific transits of the entire war. From Pearl Harbor, the ship steamed another 6 days to Tinian, arriving on July 26th, where the cargo was unloaded by crane in darkness and driven away under armed guard without any explanation. The Army officers left without saying goodbye, and 10 days later the weapon they had guarded so carefully would kill 80,000 people in a single flash. New orders sent the Indianapolis to Guam, and then onward to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines for gunnery training, and at Guam, McVeigh requested an escort for a second time. The answer came back no for a second time, with assurances that the route was reasonably safe. The routing officer who gave that assessment would later testify that he considered the waters low risk, never explaining why. Intelligence reports showing Japanese submarine activity in those exact waters sat on his desk unshared. Nobody explained why reasonable safety was considered acceptable for a heavy cruiser carrying 1,196 men. The clock read 12:02 in the morning on July 30th, 1945, and the Indianapolis was halfway between Guam and Leyte, cruising through a calm sea with no moon and poor visibility. 17 knots was her speed, and she was not zigzagging because McVeigh had standing orders that left that defensive maneuver to his discretion when visibility dropped. The night felt quiet, and the threat felt low, which was exactly the kind of thinking that gets ships killed. The Japanese submarine 158 was one of the last still hunting in the Philippine Sea, and her commander, Mochitsura Hashimoto, had spent weeks on patrol without a single kill while morale aboard steadily deteriorated. The war was clearly lost, but orders remained orders. Just before midnight, Hashimoto spotted a dark shape through his periscope, a large ship moving fast in a predictable line with no zigzag pattern and no escort to complicate his targeting. Battle stations brought his crew to readiness. 6 torpedoes loaded into their tubes, and at 12:02 he gave the order to fire. 2 torpedoes found their mark. The first struck near the bow and detonated the forward ammunition magazine, and the explosion simply erased 40 feet of the ship's front end in an instant. The second torpedo hit amidships, where it ruptured fuel tanks and severed power lines, killing the engine room crews before they understood what had happened. Steam lines burst and scalded men in the darkness while fuel oil caught fire and the ship began listing hard to starboard. Below decks, the chaos was total and the lights were gone. Emergency lanterns flickered weakly as the ship tilted and threw men from their bunks into bulkheads and debris. Water rushed through holes that no one could see, and men found themselves trapped in flooding compartments, clawing at hatches that refused to open, their screams swallowed by the darkness. On the bridge, McVeigh tried to gather damage reports while blood ran from shrapnel wounds he barely registered, but communications had failed, and the ship was listing 15 degrees and falling. Radio man First Class Elwin Sturdivant keyed the transmitter in the radio room, sending out coordinates and situation reports and pleas for help, but nobody was sure the messages went out because the power was dying and the antenna might have been damaged. They kept transmitting anyway until the water took the equipment. McVeigh ordered abandon ship, and that order traveled down passageways, shouted from one man to the next, though some never heard it because they were already dead or trapped below and would ride the ship to the bottom. 12 minutes was all the time they had, from the first torpedo to the moment the Indianapolis rolled over and slid beneath the surface. Men scrambled topside in darkness, grabbing whatever life jackets they could find. and some reached the rafts while most ended up in the water with nothing but a kapok vest and whatever they'd been wearing when the explosions woke them. Some were naked, and some were burned, and some were covered in oil that stung their eyes and choked their throats. The ship went down bow first, with her propellers still turning and her hull groaning as the ocean swallowed her, and the suction pulled men under, where some fought their way back to the surface and some did not. Fuel oil spread across the water in a dark slick that would mark this spot for days to come. 900 men survived the sinking and found themselves floating in the darkness, scattered across miles of open ocean, waiting for rescue. The sun rose over the Philippine Sea on the morning of July 30th, and brought with it the first full understanding of how bad things had gotten. Survivors drifted in scattered groups, with some clinging to rafts and some holding debris, while most floated in life jackets with nothing but empty water stretching to every horizon. No rescue ship appeared. No aircraft flew overhead. There was only the sun already beginning to burn, and the oil coating their skin magnified that heat, until men who had survived the sinking began to blister. And there were the sharks. They arrived with the daylight, mostly oceanic whitetips that grow up to 10 feet long and hunt the open water with an aggression other sharks don't share. Blood and oil and the vibration of hundreds of kicking legs drew them in, and at first they only circled and tested, bumping legs and torsos with their snouts to gauge what reacted. The first attacks came before noon, when a man would scream and the water around him would turn red, and other men would try to swim away even though there was nowhere to swim. The sharks took who they wanted when they wanted, a bump followed by a thrash, and then the screaming stopped. Survivors learned the rules quickly and passed them on to each other. Stay still and stay quiet, and never splash because movement attracts them. Never urinate in the water because they can sense it. If someone near you gets taken, move away slowly and do not look back at what's happening. Dr. Lewis Haynes served as the ship's chief medical officer and spent the next 4 days trying to keep men alive without supplies or fresh water or any hope he could put into words. He moved between groups, checking injuries he couldn't treat and calming men he couldn't save. His estimate would later put the shark deaths at dozens in the first 2 days alone, though other survivors believed the number ran higher. No one knew for certain, because the sharks left nothing behind to count. The kapok life jackets kept men afloat but absorbed water as the hours passed, and men who rode high on the first day sank to chin level by the second. Some jackets failed completely by the third day, and men who couldn't swim held on to men who could until exhaustion took them and they slipped away. Fresh water didn't exist except in a few small casks aboard the rafts, nowhere near enough for hundreds of desperate men. The brutal sun drove dehydration within hours as lips cracked and tongues swelled, and thirst became the only thought any man could hold, a need so overwhelming it drowned out fear and pain and everything else. Miles of water surrounded them, and the ocean itself became the enemy. Men started drinking seawater by the second day because the first sip brought relief to a burning throat and a swollen mouth. The body didn't know yet that it was being poisoned. Seawater carries roughly 4 times the salt concentration of human blood, and drinking it forces the kidneys into overdrive, trying to flush that excess by pulling water from the body's own tissues. The more you drink, the more dehydrated you become, cells shriveling as the brain begins to malfunction. Hallucinations set in by the second day, with men seeing islands that weren't there, or spotting the ship still floating just past the horizon. Some saw rescue planes circling overhead, while others saw hotels or restaurants, or the faces of their mothers and wives. They would announce they were swimming to get help and promise to be right back, and then they would paddle away chasing visions until they disappeared. Some men turned violent and attacked their shipmates, convinced that Japanese soldiers had infiltrated their group or that friends were secretly hoarding water. Fights broke out in the water between men too weak to stand, hands pushing heads underwater, and the officers tried to intervene, but they were weakening too. Some men simply announced with strange calm that they were going to die now, and they would slip out of their life jackets and let themselves sink, while others watched without the strength to stop them. Captain McVeigh floated with a small group near 2 rafts, his burns and cuts stinging with salt but not life-threatening. He had no idea where most of his crew had drifted because the groups had separated during that first night, and he could see nothing but water and sun and the faces of the men close enough to reach. A single container of malted milk tablets was all they had salvaged, and he rationed it carefully while keeping a mental count of the dead. He talked to the men constantly, keeping their minds focused, insisting that rescue was coming. He wondered why no one had arrived. He wondered if anyone even knew they were missing. The Navy knew the Indianapolis was overdue because she was supposed to reach Leyte Gulf on July 31st for gunnery practice. When she didn't arrive, the port director noted the absence in his log and then did absolutely nothing about it. The tracking system for ship arrivals had become a disaster of overlapping responsibilities, with nobody clearly in charge. Ships were tracked when they departed, but not necessarily when they arrived, with everyone assuming that a missing ship would be reported by someone else. The port director assumed the Indianapolis had been diverted to another mission, and the operations officer assumed someone else was tracking her, and that assumption traveled up the chain, with each officer deciding this wasn't his problem, because surely someone else was handling it. Nobody was handling it. The 3 distress signals that Sturtevant transmitted as the ship went down were either never received or actively dismissed. The Navy knew the Japanese had been broadcasting false distress calls to lure rescue ships into submarine ambushes, and when fragments of the Indianapolis transmissions reached 3 different receiving stations, the duty officers logged them as probable enemy deception. No one investigated and no one double-checked. For 4 days, the United States Navy lost track of a heavy cruiser with 1,196 men aboard, launched no search, dispatched no aircraft, and never once asked where she had gone. The men in the water kept waiting and kept believing that someone must be looking for them because the Navy doesn't just lose ships. The Navy had lost this one. August 2nd marked day 4 in the water, and a PV-1 Ventura bomber was flying a routine patrol when Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn climbed to the back of the aircraft to repair a faulty antenna weight. Looking down through a window, he noticed a long, dark oil slick against the blue water, and since damaged submarines sometimes trail oil, he descended to investigate. What he saw when he dropped lower stopped him cold. Men floated in the water below, not dozens but hundreds, scattered across miles of ocean, with some waving weakly and others motionless. Gwynn immediately radioed for help and dropped everything aboard the aircraft, including life rafts and dye markers, and he circled overhead, refusing to leave while marking the coordinates. Lieutenant Adrian Marks was piloting a PBY Catalina, a big amphibious aircraft, when the call came through. He flew to the scene and saw the sharks still circling the survivors, and he watched men being attacked in the water below. Standing orders prohibited PBY landings on open ocean because the swells could destroy the aircraft, but Marks set his plane down anyway. The hull cracked on impact, and the Catalina would never fly again, but Marks and his crew pulled 56 men from the water that afternoon. When the fuselage filled completely, they began lashing survivors to the wings with parachute cord. The destroyer, USS Cecil Doyle, arrived first among the surface ships, guided by Gwynn's radio calls. Her captain ordered the searchlights turned on, even though wartime protocol forbade it, because submarines could see that light for miles. The men in the water needed to know that help had finally come, and the captain decided that mattered more than regulations. Rescue operations continued through the night and into the next day as ships pulled men from the water across a wide area. Some survivors were found miles from the main groups, alone and barely conscious. Some were found dead but still floating in their life jackets. Some were never found at all. Of the roughly 900 men who survived the sinking, rescue ships recovered 316 alive. The other 579 were gone, drowned or taken by sharks, or dead from dehydration and madness and the simple failure of bodies pushed past human limits. That toll made this the single greatest loss of life at sea in the entire history of the United States Navy. Someone would have to answer for it. The Navy convened a court of inquiry within weeks to determine what had happened and who bore responsibility. The investigation uncovered failures at every level of the chain. Intelligence about submarine activity was never shared with McVeigh, His requests for escort were denied without adequate justification. The port tracking system failed so completely that no one noticed the ship was missing for 4 days. The distress signals were dismissed without investigation. Any single one of these failures, if corrected, might have saved hundreds of lives, and together they created a catastrophe. The court recommended no disciplinary action against any shore-based officer because the failures were systemic, and no individual bore sufficient responsibility to warrant charges, except one. Captain Charles McVay III was charged with 2 offenses, the first being failure to order abandoned ship in a timely manner, and the second being hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag in conditions of poor visibility. The first charge was quietly dropped before trial because the evidence didn't support it, and 12 minutes isn't much time to save a dying ship. The second charge went to court-martial in December of 1945. The trial became extraordinary when the Navy flew Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto from occupied Japan to Washington to testify. The man who had sunk the Indianapolis took the stand and described the attack through a translator, explaining that conditions were ideal with calm seas and a visible target and his submarine perfectly positioned. When the defense asked whether zigzagging would have made any difference, Hashimoto answered with complete certainty that it would not have mattered because he would have adjusted his aim and hit the ship regardless. The enemy who sank the Indianapolis told an American court that McVay did nothing wrong, and the court convicted him anyway. The verdict found McVay guilty of hazarding his ship through failure to zigzag, and the sentence stripped him of seniority in a way that would end his career. Admiral Chester Nimitz reviewed the case and remitted the sentence entirely, allowing McVay to return to duty, and he eventually retired in 1949 with the rank of Rear Admiral. The Navy had found its scapegoat, and officially the case was closed. It would never actually close. Letters started arriving at McVay's home almost immediately after the trial. Families of dead sailors needed someone to blame, and the Navy was too large and too abstract, while McVay was a man with a name and an address that anyone could find. Some of those letters expressed gratitude from widows and parents who understood what had happened and refused to hold him responsible. People who knew their sons and husbands had served under a good commander. Many letters carried no such understanding. The accusations were direct and brutal. "You killed my son. Why did you survive when my boy didn't? I hope you can live with yourself, because I will never forgive you. Merry Christmas, Captain. Our family will never be whole again because of what you did." That final example captures something important, because the letters came heaviest every year around Christmas, when the holiday mail swelled, and McVay would find envelope after envelope from strangers who blamed him for their grief. He read every letter that arrived and answered every single one with careful, respectful sorrow, never defending himself and never pointing to the Navy's failures, and never naming the officers who had denied him escort or withheld intelligence. He accepted their anger and carried their grief as his own. A second marriage came in 1951, and he moved to a farm in Litchfield, Connecticut, trying to build something quiet, far from the ocean. Horses grazed his land and gardens grew under his care, and he rarely spoke about the war. The letters kept coming regardless, and his friends watched the guilt that never faded, and the silences that stretched longer, and the drinking that worsened around certain dates. Late July brought the anniversary, and December brought the Christmas mail, and both seasons ground him down year after year. He kept a memento from childhood, a small toy sailor that his father had given him, and it stayed close through everything that followed. November 6th of 1968 found Charles McVay III walking onto the front porch of his Connecticut farmhouse at 70 years old, holding his Navy-issued revolver in one hand and that toy sailor in the other. His gardener discovered him that morning, and the Navy ruled he had taken his own life. 23 years of letters, and 23 years of blame, and 23 years of carrying weight that the Navy should have shared had finally become too much. The system had broken, and one man had paid the price. This should have been where the story ended, and for decades it was. Then in 1996, a 12-year-old boy in Florida named Hunter Scott watched the movie Jaws for the first time and heard the character Quint deliver a monologue about the Indianapolis describing the sinking and the sharks and the days spent floating in the water. Scott didn't know if any of it was real, so he looked it up and discovered that everything was true. A school history project became an obsession as Scott researched the sinking and found the names of living survivors and began calling them to ask questions and record their answers. Many of these men had never told their full stories to anyone, not to their families or their neighbors, carrying the memories for 50 years in silence. They told Hunter Scott everything about the water and the sharks and the friends they watched die and the court-martial that had destroyed a man who didn't deserve destruction. Scott interviewed more than 150 survivors and compiled their testimony into evidence that McVeigh had been wrongly convicted. He wrote letters to congressmen, and in 1999, at 14 years old, he testified before the United States Senate Armed Services Committee. The survivors rallied behind this teenager and demanded that McVeigh's name be cleared. Men in their 70s and 80s who had floated in that water and watched sharks circle their friends stood up and fought for the truth. McVeigh had been dead for 30 years, so this wasn't about helping him anymore, but about the record and about justice and about the principle that wrongs can still be righted even when the wronged can no longer benefit. October of 2000 saw Congress pass a resolution stating that Captain McVeigh's record should reflect his exoneration for the loss of the USS Indianapolis and the deaths of her crew, and President Clinton signed it into law. The resolution couldn't overturn the court-martial because the legal system didn't allow for that, but it placed into the official record what survivors had known since 1945. McVeigh was not responsible for the deaths of 879 men. The Navy was. A memorial stands today on the Canal Walk in downtown Indianapolis, a bronze silhouette of the ship rising life-sized from a fountain with the name of every man who sailed on that final voyage engraved into the surrounding stone. Tourists walk through in summer and pause at this name or that to take photographs, and at night, the memorial lights from below make the ship seem to float on the water like a ghost of itself. The survivors used to gather there every few years, coming back fewer and older and slower each time, but still present, still together, not needing to say much because they all remembered. Harlan Twible died in 2023 at 95 years old as the last living survivor, and now every man who floated in that water has passed from the world. A research team led by Paul Allen located the wreck in 2017, resting 18,000 feet down on the floor of the Philippine Sea. The bow sits separated from the hull, where that first torpedo tore it away, and the rest of the ship stands upright on the bottom, encrusted with sea life after 7 decades of silence. What survives when the ship is beyond reach and the survivors are all gone and the Navy has never formally apologized and the court-martial still stands on the books? The question survives. Why did no one come for 4 days when the Navy knew the ship was overdue? Why did 879 men die waiting for rescue, while duty officers assumed someone else was handling it? Why was the only man held accountable the one who had the least power to prevent any of it? The answers explain the mechanics of failure through intelligence breakdowns and tracking failures and assumptions that became excuses, and a system designed so that everyone held responsibility and no one held accountability. Those answers are true, but they don't explain the letters or the porch. Some failures grow too large to pin on any individual, so they get pinned on no one at all, or they get pinned on the one person too honorable to point fingers back. McVeigh never blamed anyone publicly and never went to the press and never wrote a book and never demanded that the officers who failed him face any consequences. He accepted the court-martial and the verdict and 23 years of Christmas letters from families who needed someone to hate. He carried the weight because nobody else would touch it. The survivors forgave him and his crew loved him, and the man who sank his ship testified under oath that McVeigh had done nothing wrong, and none of that was enough. Some wounds refuse to heal because healing would require an institution to admit wrongdoing, and the cost of that admission always seems higher than the cost of destroying one man. McVeigh paid for a catastrophe he didn't cause, and he remains the only person who ever did. If this story meant something to you, please like and subscribe, because your support makes these investigations possible. Tell me in the comments which ship we should cover next. The Yorktown was lost at Midway and resurrected 3 times in name. The Juno went down with 5 brothers aboard, or maybe something forgotten, a ship with a story nobody tells anymore. These aren't just machines, because they're the men who served on them and the families who waited for them and the questions we still haven't answered. Every ship costs something, and some of those costs we're still counting.